this conversation. The way we, and thank you to Milo for the introduction, the way we decided to organize it is we'll start with a short presentation on, because I have two concurrent projects right now, one at Recess Art in Brooklyn and here at Center for Book Arts, and a little bit about the background of how this came together, and also kind of like the larger project which this came out of. So again, my name is Helina Metaferia, and this exhibition, or this, I would say, this project, this book project is called Bin Magic, Bin Real. And we can talk a little bit more about why it's called that. And this is kind of the reference material for the work. It's based on Ethiopian talisman healing scrolls, which is maybe a lesser known art history, and it's a very old tradition that still exists today, especially in rural parts of Ethiopia. The talisman scrolls are traditionally made by men that operate as sort of shamans or I would say like priests in the countryside. It's a sort of church-adjacent tradition, which integrates a lot of prayers and Ge'ez, which is like the old Ethiopian language. And there's some iconography that is very specialized, and it's supposed to be a sort of talisman that you can wear. Similarly, the book that I've created is a talisman that you can wear. It has a carrying case, it has particular symbols that are supposed to evoke certain spirits and ward off certain spirits. So that's where this scroll book idea came from. And this is the presentation that you see here. So the variation that I've created has a modern twist, a contemporary twist. There's more of an emphasis on me being a female practitioner, making, because the scrolls are traditionally made for women by men, and so there's that power dynamic. And most of the women are actually, they can be illiterate because it's quite in the countryside, and so I've sort of tried to invert that by making crowdsourced text that's compiled in a very simple way that, you know, as you can see here, there's an installation where people can submit text on what they consider an everyday revolution, and that's how the text is composed. So the prayers or the magical spells are really just our affirmations for existence. And the photographs are participants of previous workshops that I've facilitated, which I'll talk a little bit more about. The iconography or the talisman symbols are appropriated from the original source. I am not a shaman, so this is kind of like my contemporary rendition of what this could look like. And it was made as a risograph limited edition print, and the way that I came about doing it at Center for Book Arts was an invitation from Karina Reynolds, who's the director at CBA. We did a studio visit, and I told her about this thing I want to do for like a long time. I don't want to say how old, but I was 20 years old when I first started learning about this as an intern at the Walters Art Museum, and I've been obsessed with them. And I was making sketches. I was like, I kind of want to do something. And she's like, why don't you do a book? Why can't it be a scroll book? We can help you produce it. So it really is with the generous support of the CDA that this was realized, because it was living in my mind for quite a while. And the timing of it is actually quite perfect, because there's a exhibition that's touring that I'm a part of called Ethiopia at the Crossroads. We have a catalog for that in the back in the reading section. But it juxtaposes contemporary artists, Ethiopian artists, with these sort of older traditions of medieval through contemporary works. And so it gives a lot more context. And I knew I wanted to connect with Kiki about this for the discussion, and we just had some really great studio visits, because as a fellow Ethiopian American cultural worker, I just felt like you could understand sort of the displacement. I was born in the US and trying to make sense and grapple with a culture and our history that I'm like self-teaching myself essentially, because it's not readily available in a larger education system. So I also included in this presentation some of my headdress collages, which I'll talk a little bit more about how they're made. The next project that I'll just talk about is the meeting place, which is currently on view at Recess Art in Brooklyn through June 20th. It's a project space. I'm someone who really just integrates and interweaves everything I do. I can't compartmentalize too much. I'm a teacher, so my teaching comes into my facilitation work. I'm a maker, so when I'm doing everything, it's like with a maker sensibility, and I'm an organizer and an activist, so everything comes out of this idea of like bringing disparate people and things together. So the meeting place is a newer project, but it's an extension of previous work. It's a space where workshops are constantly happening. I call them meetings. And I'm rethinking the idea of what a meeting is, an encounter. Technically, just like very literally, a meeting is, dictionary definition is two or more people meeting by chance or with intention. And so I was really interested in how to make really intentional meetings that can also have these moments of chance embedded within them that are maybe not the loaded bureaucratic ones that we may experience in our day-to-day lives, but ones filled with wonder and curiosity and less with judgment and tension. And so this is the project, and most of the workshops are available for BIPOC femmes. It's the audience that I work mostly with in my work. I facilitated the first workshop, which was a performance artist protest workshop. Other guest facilitators have come through, such as Ola from Free Black Women's Library, who facilitated an Octavia Butler inspired writing workshop. We had the Palestinian dance troupe come from Haifa in Israel. Just actually came off the plane and did the workshop, which was amazing. And that was last Saturday, and that's the Asamara Dance Theater. And then for Juneteenth, we'll have a Wide Awake meditation celebration, which I'm really excited about. And yeah, I didn't include a clip of the dancing and the movement, but you can kind of get a sense for the short presentation of like what these activities look like. I usually don't document these at all, so this is the first time I'm actually, like, in 6 years of doing these workshops around the country, actually taking the risk to see what it would be like to have the lens there, mostly because I really wanted to have a container space where people can go very deep very quickly, and it's hard to build trust when there's a lot of sort of like, where's this gonna land and what's gonna happen? So there was a lot of conversation around the documentation, how it will be used, a lot of consent forms being filled, and I'm making a film about this work. And so that's really important for me, that there is some sort of like legacy that happens beyond it. And I felt Recess was the right partner project to do something like that. There's the protest signs that you see that live in the windowsill are actually the same ones where all my texts are really coming from this crowdsourced anonymous submission process. The table that's in the space also has this engraving of like a laser cut and then hand painted engraving of text. Which is people's responses to what a revolution is. And I know I offer this question as a moment for contemplation, because it's very challenging to think about what change is, and everybody wants it and nobody can agree, and then I think that's essentially where the conflict starts to come from. But having art as a mediary and having this sort of like silent thing that you can participate in a community of people you don't know across the country just feels like a great way to mediate some of that heavier dialogue. So this is the meeting table, and we do a lot of our workshops there. There's also a BIPOC Femme library that's growing, and people have been coming through the meeting place during open public hours and just reading, and you can add a bookmark with your thoughts and reflections, and somebody else can also pick up from that spot and write. So there's this way where you can be in solitude in the meeting place, but you can also be in community at the same time, which I'm really curious about. There's also activities that you can do, and a lot of these activities were made by my students. So again, I incorporate everything I do all the time. So my students have become practitioners of the meeting place and have helped to facilitate a lot of this. And the last project I'll share to give context to our conversation is By Way of Revolution. So this started in 2018, and it's kind of, one project usually births the next project. And so By Way of Revolution birthed the meeting place, or maybe vice versa. They've been always in tandem. And then that gave way to Been Magic, Been Real. And so By Way of Revolution started in 2018, and it started with these kind of workshops. I was at Michigan State University and invited as a visiting artist and professor to do a lot of programming, and I was like, well, I'm constantly being called on for service, and so especially as a Black woman professor. And so I was like, I'm going to make service my art as an artist in residence. I was also really tied to a personal narrative that I'll share, and I've shared publicly quite often. My mother passed in 2016, and she was an Ethiopian women's rights activist, and I really wanted to connect more with her from a state of grief, but really it just became a continuing of what she was very passionate about, the work she had been doing for about 40 years as an expat Ethiopian woman living in the US, helping to free political prisoners in Ethiopia or to advocate for women's rights legislation with an organization that she founded. And so for me, I mean, I was never interested in the heavy stuff of that work. I felt like I would escape into art as a young person, and yet art brought me back into the work that she was essentially doing. And so for me, I find myself uplifting other activists and uplifting their legacies in the work. So after I do these workshops, I usually engage local activists or students, and they become my research assistants. So I never do things in isolation. I'm always doing things in tandem with others. It's actually just, I want to make that as visible as possible because this project is about labor and it's about foregrounding often overlooked labor. And so there's these archives that I would spend my time in, libraries around the country and internationally of undigitized, and it's really important that I say I don't grab things from the internet. I really take time to like dig through and foreground what's not yet digitized by libraries. And these are protests that are not just randomly selected. I do a deep questionnaire and sometimes a Zoom call with my participants in my workshops. So I pair the archives with them into these collages, these hand-cut, painted, assembled collages. And so it really becomes a back and forth collaboration with the participant. So the relationship starts with a workshop or a meeting or an encounter, and it goes beyond that. And it has many other iterations, including including collages, sometimes sculpture, sometimes other forms, tapestries, performances. Sometimes people come back into my work through performance engagement. So this was at the MFA Boston, the last one was at the Frist Art Museum, a traveling show, and this was at Fisk University and Frist University Libraries in Nashville. So my goal is to like hit all 50 states with this, and it's also gone international. I think it's just like a project that you just know when something has leg wings because it's still needed. Like I still feel like I started this in 2018 and I still feel like it's very much needed. These gatherings, these sort of upliftment of Black women, sort of attention towards activism as labor. And so, yeah, and then, they also become physical crowns too that gets worn in performances with etched archives. Each collage has a bibliography, each crown has a bibliography. Everything I do has that level of like foregrounding where the material is to point people back to the public domain. So this is the same question that I ask people here, what is your everyday revolution? And sometimes it becomes a table, sometimes it becomes a scroll book, sometimes it becomes protest signs or hand-painted protest signs. And then there's always a free thing that you get in return. So there's you can download a protest sign, you can get a button from the table, like of somebody else's thoughts. Here there's an audio recording of the book with 13 performers who graciously performed the audio book. I love listening to it as like a meditation in the morning. I will get ready, listen to the audiobook, ready to go. So, and then the last couple things I'll show. This is the call video. I don't have the video, but there's this excerpt on my website. Descendants of civil rights leaders, Frederick Douglass's descendants, Dick Gregory's daughter, James Baldwin's sister. And they're in conversation about the matriarchs in their family who are lesser known to, I guess, the wider audience, and so like this becomes an oral document. So I'm always interested in the oral archive, the living archive, the embodied somatic practice archive. And the last thing I'll share is just the Sharjah Art Biennial, the performance I did with them. This performance, I'm actually re-performing a version of this at Kadist in San Francisco next week, so I'm getting on a plane tomorrow. And it's actually like a really endearing performance. I always bring in outside like singers to come in to use sound to activate the space. We're going to do a processional next week between Kadist and Dolores Park, which is about 15-minute with the audience. This one was like more of a circular form. And I could show a video and then I think we could go into Q&A. So how do I do that? Thank you. one.
Oh, this isn't? Okay.
But we could play this.
No.
It's not the one I wanted, but
What's the one you want?
maybe I didn't give it to you. Yeah.
This one?
No. That's my fault. I'm just bringing in the performance late. Well, I'll give you this one because why not? We can play a different one. This is a version of The Willing. Does it have sound?
We don't have because we
sorry.
didn't.
That's fine.
Right.
I'll just play this and then we'll go back to the.
And you can make it full screen.
Okay, I'll talk over it. So this is another version of the Willing, not the Sharjah one, and mixed up what I said to Camilo. But in this version, I engaged my my then 11-year-old niece. She's now 13, I believe. In this performance where we tell the story of the women in our family. So 5 generations of activism, whether it's overt activism like shouting and screaming and marching, like my mother may have done, or the like lesser forms of activism, whether it's simply maintaining the home while there's a war happening going on down the street, and when your husband's in prison and you have 13 kids, like that is a form of like maintaining community, right? And so that was my great grandmother. Yeah. So there's all these different stories that were like archives or oral histories that were passed to me, and so I passed that on. I passed the crown to my niece, and I passed that on. And then I asked the women in the audience to also share who they walk with, what holds them. And it becomes like a very, this was a more personal one, but they're either personal, artistic, or political lineages. So yeah, I think I'll like end there. Sorry about the lack of sound, but yeah, I think the discussion is what we're here for. So let's get into that. I'm gonna just start with this. Oh, now I need to do slideshow and then hit play. Sure.
Thank you, Helina, for this wonderful presentation. I think being able to end it on seeing the video was very powerful and gives us a strong sense of your practice. I also want to extend my gratitude to Camilo and Center for Book Arts for hosting this conversation. And I thought we might begin with the title of this exhibition, Been Magic, Been Real, which is a very potent name for an exhibition and opens itself up to many different interpretations. I know there was a lot of back and forth deliberation about the name for this exhibition, so wondering if you can share more about how you landed on this title and what it represents in terms of this new development in your practice.
Yeah, I actually was like back and forth because I was like, there's so many things. I knew magic should be in it because although we don't call it, in Ethiopia, we don't call it magic scrolls. Whenever Westerners write about this art tradition, they call it magic. And so I was just thinking about all the ways Africanness and Blackness have been used and in context of magic. Whether it's like hashtag Black Girl Magic, which is a way of us claiming our own like super strength to endure white supremacy and patriarchy and all of these isms. Or whether it's like magical realism and the sort of fictional sort of telling of an occurrence, or the trope of the magical Negro, or like just all of these ways in which magic has either been positive or negatively used in reference to Blackness. But the idea that we've always been those things, but we've also always been very real, in the sense of like keeping it real as another sort of way to bring in vernacular and dialogue. So yeah, that's how I came up with that title.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about how the scrolls are referred to as magic by people who are writing about them, but may not necessarily be super familiar with the culture. And there's ways that Ethiopian art and artifacts are written about that are not necessarily the most representative of how they might be seen by people who are using these objects of material culture. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that you encountered the healing scrolls when you were working at the Walters Museum as an intern, and that experience there when you were researching a lot of Ethiopian art was very formative for you because it cemented your belief that you were meant to be an artist and not meant to do office work. However, you still incorporate a lot of research into your art practice, so it'd be great to hear more about how you came into your journey of being an artist and recognize that you wanted to incorporate research in this specific way.
Yeah. I realize my slideshow isn't playing, so I'm going to try one more time so we can actually see those scrolls. Yeah.
If you click where it says normal, change it to self-play or on the
yeah,
sidebar.
that's the thing that we were trying to do
Yeah.
last time to undo it. We have to redo it, I guess.
Click there and then
Perfect.
self-play.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I feel like the internship was actually in my formative years. I was an art student, and I was like, let me get something under my belt that can actually show that I can get like work, as with this art degree. Like, let me do a curatorial internship, and I had told you about my at the time it was like cubicle life, and I was like, it wasn't even Zoom life, and I was like, oh no, this isn't my path. I was much more of a maker, but I was fascinated with these scrolls because I was the first Ethiopian person to work with that collection, and they have the largest Ethiopian art outside of Ethiopia, largest collection. Some of it, I always wonder how these things get acquired, but it was something about the context, because some of it was very religious art, and having grown up in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, I just wasn't used to seeing it in a museum context as a 20-year-old person, and so I was like, okay, let me kind of reconcile or kind of figure out what my voice is in this, and I knew that my voice was to maybe not necessarily to respond to what was there, but I wanted to make something for that context that could wrestle with. I do a lot of institutional critique, and I think that was when my institutional critique was born. It was I wanted to wrestle with the sort of out of placeness of my Africanness and my Americanness in that context, because I was born in the U.S., but also the peculiar aspects of museums and museum studies where there may be appropriation of culture, or there may be, I guess, an overlook, an oversight of meaning and context. And so that was something I wanted to readdress. And so all these years later, I feel like this project is readdressing that. And it's just so ironic that I was invited to do this show at the Walters Art Museum, which has been traveling, and now it's at Peabody Essex, and we'll go to the Helina Museum with that same collection. So I feel like everything is just timing. I really wanted to do this project for a while. CBA reached out to me. We were gonna do it before right around the pandemic. The pandemic just pushed everything back, and then the timing worked out. So yeah.
Glad, yeah. You mentioned growing up in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and you've also mentioned that you were raised in a family that stayed very connected to Ethiopia despite being based in the U.S. In the Washington, D.C. area. Your father is a political scientist, your mother was a political organizer for women's rights, both in Ethiopia and at home in the U.S. Can you share more about what kind of conversations you heard growing up about Ethiopia, and if those conversations included art, or was that something that you came more to on your own as an artist?
Yeah, so if any of you have felt like you've been a part of more than one world, it's like being in the U.S., I very much feel my Americanness, but I also feel a strange connection to something outside of that because of how I grew up being here. But when I'm in Ethiopia, clearly I'm an American, so it's this always trying to go back and forth between and making sense of home. And part of how I've made sense of home is this sort of romanticized home that I internalized because my family came before the Red Terror time, so basically before the Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown, which was, if you had come after that time of this country, it may have been for different reasons. So the people who came before 1974, I think they came for education, they came for diplomacy, and so my parents came for school, and then they just couldn't go back. They never planned to stay, but because of just political and economic strife, they couldn't go back, and so I think I have this 1970s and prior idea of what Ethiopia is, and I went for the first time at 13, and I've been, I guess, five times. My father couldn't go for 40 years because of his political work, and he could go now now that the government changed. And so it was just like something that it's very, I think it's just always going to be different depending on individual home context. But art was not something I learned anything about. I had a public school teacher who actually came to this opening randomly. She was gonna, I hadn't seen her in like 17 years. She called Camilo and was like, how do I get a book and how can I come? And he told me, and so that's how I found out that she was coming. But it was great. We had a really great reunion here. But she's the reason. She's a Black woman, African American woman. She like made sure that she saw some talent in me, and she made sure that she was like, you could do this. You could like go into that. So I think it was through her that I became an artist. And she was the kind of teacher that would call you if you were missing school. Like I couldn't skip class. Like she would always call my mom and like make sure I was in class. So she was above and beyond. And I also studied with Helina Metaferia, who was a prolific artist. And so I've always had Black women educators in my life who kind of like shepherd me. I went to Morgan State for undergrad at HBCU, so I always had that kind of, and so I think that's part of why I teach. My mother was also a teacher, so I feel like teaching for me is a way to pay that forward. But that's how I became an artist.
It's amazing to hear about that trajectory and the way it connects in some ways indirectly to the conversations that your parents were having with you and talking about with you when it came to Ethiopia. I want to pivot a bit and talk about some of the works that you have on view in this exhibition, particularly these two collage portraits that come from your By Way of Revolution series. These portraits include images from different protests included in archives that you found in Nashville. And they speak to your attention when it comes to composition, the way that you're forming these shapes and images around the sitters' heads, as well as the content of the images themselves are very powerful. They show documentation of protests during challenging times in the U.S.'s history. I'm wondering if you can speak a bit about collage in your practice and the importance it has had for you.
Yeah, so I think I was saying a little bit in my presentation earlier, like I approach everything as integration, and for me, organizing work is artwork, and vice versa. Artwork for me is organizing, and that's whether it's organizing your life, your calendar, your home, your community. Like I just always think of it in that way, and so I guess the through line for all my work is that I'm interested in the gathering. Whether it's the gathering of people, and not always the harmony of it. Like I'm also okay with the tension. I love things that are beautiful, but I'm also happy with the grotesque. Like let's go into all of the things. And so this headdress series, it really did come from Ethiopian culture once again, because we had a monarchy for a very long time. The crowning is the sort of empowerment sort of way to fight off colonizers, for example. However, there's also the Black is Beautiful aesthetic of the 1970s that I always loved, and I think that there's something about bringing that vernacular back into this contemporary time that can really hold us through as it has in previous periods. And so I forget the other parts of the question, but I think the sitters are participants for past workshops. The archives came from Fisk University National Public Library. The librarians become my collaborators and my accomplices. Nothing happens unless they are on board with it. So a lot of the time I'm like making sure that we're friends because they are the ones helping me access these. And we have to have a lot of conversations about fair use and rights. Oftentimes there's a fee for scanning. They've often waived that fee or reduced it tremendously for me. So, and it's like letting them understand that artists can also use the archive in a non-traditional, non-scholarly, traditional scholarly way. And I think a lot of people have been very interested in that.
Can you speak more about the role of archives in your work? Because as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these images come from archives in Nashville, and your work has taken you to a lot of different places where you're engaging with archives in different cities throughout the U.S. And it'd be interesting to hear more about your work with archives and specifically thinking about local histories.
Yeah, so as an artist, I think all artists for those of you who are artists in the room, we have to reconcile with the fact that when we are invited to do projects in other cities, we are a visitor. And for grounding the people who work, I hate to use the word local because it just feels like a marginalized way of talking about artists, but the ones who are more rooted, I would say, in that community are also people that I collaborate with, whether it's as performers within the work, participants, people who actually help other people come to the work and let people know about the work. So the relationship building is something that takes quite a while. I would say each site that I work with, it's usually about a year and a half, 2 years that I'm working in that site, and I'm working with multiple sites simultaneously. So right now I'm in the Bay Area. I've been working with the Bay Area for a year. It'll conclude at the end of this year. And I'm also working in Brooklyn with the Recess community, and that's going to be ongoing. And so the presentations may happen at various institutions or organizations there, but really it's the connections with the community. And so they come back into the work, they come back to see the shows, we have conversations beyond. And the archives, I'm working with research assistants. There's no way I can do this amount of scanning and looking, and I cannot absorb all of this. And so we have a system that my team we're working with, and I want to hire and find grant funding to hire local activists and students. So that's how this work has come about. But the process of archiving for me is about preservation, it's about legacy, it's about also what's not in the archive, because a lot of the archives are quite incomplete. And you'll be very surprised at what you find in a library that special collections is on radicalism. Like I've seen Kenyan travel posters, Ethiopian travel posters as radical, basically anything othering. And then sometimes there's like the left is mixed in with the right, so you'll have KKK material in there. It's actually quite complicated, and the amount of women's labor is incomplete. And even though I have a bibliography, I cannot name all the people in that collage. I don't think anyone can. So that's actually what I think is interesting, is when I've met people who are like, oh my God, I know that person, or I went to school with that person, this person's a lawyer now, or I'm like, oh, that makes sense. But yeah, they'll give me I get more oral history from these than what the library repositories actually can hold. Because essentially it's people who have families, who have friends, who've made impact.
It's amazing to hear about the impact that seeing these images has for people who are in the communities and active and can be able to spot people who they know in the images. I also want to take a chance to speak about the scroll book, Been Magic, Been Real, and thinking about how this presentation here has given you the opportunity to think about the book as an art object, as is the Center for Book Art's mission. And I'm wondering if you can speak to thinking about the book as an art form, as well as sound as an art form, and the ways that you mentioned seeing this book and the audio component of this exhibition as visual and auditory medicine.
Yeah. Well, I really wanted to deconstruct the word magic, because although we love the mystery in the word, there's some like elements that keep coming up in all cultures and traditions, and the word is one of them. And the word and the saying of the word, the incantation of the word. So the affirmation for me is now a community responsibility, right? Like as opposed to like, and I'm always rethinking power dynamics in institutions. And so instead of giving it all to the priest or to a particular shaman, or saying that we, the community, can create the word, right, in a very organic way. And so the installation allows for the word to be brought in. Of course, there's editing. I'm editing it. I'm not going to take every submission, and there's actually quite a lot of repeats, which is quite beautiful to see. But it's been like 6 years of looking through thousands of submissions about what revolution is, and for me, that's a transformation in itself. It's transformed me, and so I'm hoping that this book, and I humbly say, I'm hoping it offers some sort of transformation. Like when you read it, what does it inspire, right? And one thing I want it to be, just like traditional healing scrolls, is they are usually the height of a person. So this is 5'5". I am not 5'5", but it's like the average maybe woman, I would say. And then they are usually, you can carry, you can wear it, so they are protective scrolls. And they're usually recited, and if this person cannot read, they are read, somebody reads it to them. And so this is for medicine, right? So they're usually made for women as like for people going through fertility issues, for women going through health issues, for whatever spiritual issues. And so people would make this on parchment, and they would make this specifically for you. And so I love this idea that the magic is from the community and still with the community. It's a risograph print. It's accessible and affordably priced, and so there's like this, the taking out of maybe the, I don't want to say the, I want to take out the mystery and demystify it a little bit more, if that makes sense, and make it accessible, because like all things, religion is a form of power, you know, and religious institutions are forms of power, and so I'm always deconstructing and saying, how can we get power back and power to, right? And power over. I'm sorry, instead of powering over, how can we power to each other, if that makes sense? So, like ethical forms of relationship building.
It's interesting to think about that in terms of power, but also accessibility in terms of audiences. I think this is an interesting way to learn about the Ethiopian Healing School for general audiences, but I'm also thinking about myself as like a diasporic subject who, you know, is learning about this for the first time in a deeper context through your work. And this is something that makes the Healing School something that's much more accessible to learn about. As you mentioned, they also include snippets of responses from your participatory work, the work, and how that's also something that you included in the Recess exhibition through the table. I'm curious, how has inviting visitors and audiences to participate and respond to your work changed or shifted your practice?
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, I teach social practice art too at Brown, and it's a new field, and it's also, I love how the art world institutionalizes everything that artists are doing, especially things that we're doing counter-institution, and now I'm teaching it. So it's quite like, I just feel like this, like, oh my gosh, this like, all the radical makers are probably like, oh, this is a shame. But it's also a way to archive it and to like help foster that in future artists. So we talk a lot in my classes about ethics as like more than I have in any other kind of course I've taught. Like I don't get that as much in the painting course or drawing course or sculpture course. But we're talking about that as a methodology, because more than aesthetic, I think social practice or social engage art really relies on like how people are coming together for this project. And so this idea of extraction is something that we're trying to sort of avoid, and the idea that somebody participates on their own will to do something, to me, is still very fascinating. Like all of you have, on your own will, hopefully, have come here and participated. I think it's fascinating that people take their time, which is one of their biggest resources and energy, for art. And also, if it's performance or social practice, you don't necessarily know the outcome. It's not like, okay, a talk, here's the format, here's the recipe theater, okay, we have the stage, there's gonna be intermission, it's about this amount of time. But these forms are very experimental, which for me is very exciting as a maker and as an artist who likes to experience it. But it's also like, what do you want me to do, and how are you gonna use it, and why do you want my body, and like, you wanna photograph me and put something on my head? So for me, it's been very much like how the methodology of how I bring people into the work. I want people to feel like they always have an option, and that they can always opt out. They can come see the work, but instead of just being voyeuristic, they can also participate. So that's a bit about the methodology. And the audiobook, I think, was also great, because I just asked a bunch of friends, and then like 13 of my friends was like, yeah, let's do it. And I was like, okay, here's what you get for doing the book. You get a book, and then here's what, you know, this. And so I just always am thinking about that exchange of value.
You mentioned some of the questions that might come up for participants in terms of their involvement with this work and developing your own methodology. I wonder if you can talk a bit more about how you found yourself in social practice and how you started as an artist in painting.
Yeah, I started as a painter, like many people who were introduced to art in public school or wherever, you know, education. And I didn't come from an art background. There's no one that I know of that's an artist in my family yet, although we have a new generation to start to influence. And so I started with painting, and then I went to undergraduate school and said, I'm gonna be a painter, because that's what I do. And I was painting figures and after that I kept the studio, and I was just painting figures, and I got bored, to be honest. I was so bored. I was like, okay, stretching canvas, we did that before. Okay, mixing colors, you know. And then I hit a rut in my like art making, and then I met Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, who was teaching at the time at Tufts, SMFA Tufts in Boston. And she was like, come study with me. And I was like, okay. She was just so dynamic, and she did all these things with her body, and I knew I was painting figures. I was painting myself or my friends in community, but I was like enthralled with the idea of moving and speaking and shouting, which is the language of feminist activism, right? Like that is the language, like a lot of performance art, collage, these mediums are inherently political in sort of in their application and their histories. And when I got to graduate school, I was a painting major at first, and I was like, oh my God, I had to recite kind of the dead white man canon, and I was like, I can't do it. This is where we draw the line. I was bored. I was like ready to move on. So I was taking a bunch of performance classes, video, and all of a sudden I ended up in new genres as a pathway. And I still am not. I'm now using paint. I mean, there's paint all in me sort of making, but it's on my own accord, and I get to name the histories I want to be in conversation with, and that's the beauty of being out of school and now being a teacher. But like also like being a grown-up artist and not having to like that canon was so weighing on me. But yeah, that's kind of how I came into it, and social practice came later. And I kind of like, I think I came into that because again, as an academic artist, the level of service that is put on you, especially as a woman and as a black woman, it just became like, I was like, this is gonna be my art. I have to integrate everything to make all of these hats work, or else nothing's gonna happen. Like my art will suffer, my human personhood would suffer, so I just keep integrating. So I was like, okay, you want me to do a lot of service, particularly with a particular community? It's in the work, and then all the hats are being attended to. But most of the time I'm foregrounding how that was put on our bodies. Like that labor is often, labor doesn't get you tenure necessarily. It doesn't get you, recognition. Most of the people who did the lunches and the breakfast program in the Black Panther Party, I mean, 60% of the Black Panther Party was women. We don't see them documented in the newspapers, right? So it's like the thankless service that makes the world run. And I'm quite interested in foregrounding that.
There's a strong attention to the undertold narratives through your practice, and I'm glad that you were able to find a way to incorporate all these different ways of making it to your practice, because I think it makes it stronger. I'm wondering if you can talk about the inspiration for the exhibition title At Recess, the meeting place, and what is the importance of gatherings for you. I know that this is a title that's also inspired by your Ethiopian heritage and the idea of mahabut, or meeting in art.
I love that you brought up mahabut. I haven't heard that word for the Ethiopians in the room. It's nice to have somebody in conversation with who I don't have to like explain. But mahabut does, I guess it technically means meeting. Yeah. We had mahabuts growing up. When I would go to Ethiopia, my grandmother's house was like the place where the family would gather, and every month I think, and there's always also different, I think there's just so many gatherings that I've grown up with that were mostly familial, or because we lived in DC and my mother was an activist, she would like drag me as a young kid to like candlelight vigils and protests. Like that was my early memories, or like sleeping on the floor of Haile Garima's bookstore, Sankofa, because they would have their meetings on the top floor. And if y'all don't know Haile, he's a big influence for me too. He's an amazing filmmaker who did this film called Sankofa. And yeah, I think those kinds of, the cooking in the kitchen, and then the telling of like either the family story or the news of the day, or like that kind of maternal passing on, I think was emphasis for me for the meeting place. I don't know how you all feel, especially with the artists in the room, but the word meetings is so loaded for me. It feels like equivalent to other words that we have historically had to switch up and reclaim. So I just needed to reclaim that word and make it, I had to reclaim the space too that it happens, as opposed to the space of potential power and conflict and abuse of power and all of these things, or the place that feels very dull and like I need to run out of here, or the place you feel encaged by, you know, instead reclaiming that, reimagining that. And it's also, to me, the meeting place is the place where it goes down. Like, it's also just another more, like, I want to conspire here, I want to cook something up here. So, yeah, those are some things that came to mind when I thought about that.
And the Recess exhibition also has workshops associated with it. Can you talk more about what it has been like planning those workshops and what kind of connections there are between the workshops that are part of those programs and the workshops that you conduct for By Way of Revolution?
Yeah, so workshop as a methodology, I'm really glad to work with Recess because I love their curriculum. They are an abolitionist organization, it's written in the mission, and I'm like, how y'all get funding when you're an abolitionist organization? But I just love that exists. They have the assembly program where they work with system impacted youth, and they have all been a part of the meeting place in many forms, whether workshops or helping to paint the table, all of that. And so we were very mission aligned, and then they have a somatic practice curriculum, and I work with somatic practices in my performances and also in my facilitation. So we've just been it's helped to grow the work a lot and how a meeting is conducted. And I've had great conversations with Sean Leonardo, who's the co-director, and just their social worker there. And so really, I would say another accomplice for me, if I want to keep naming out accomplices, is Recess for sure. And they asked me, like, are you sure you want to like bring outside facilitators, because how's that going to go? And I was like, yeah, because I don't want this to be about the cult of another artist. Like, I don't want to be this like other cult leader that's like, come to my meetings, it's where everything happens. I just want it to be a place where, and maybe even give the model as a blueprint to other spaces to do. Like I wanted to work with other thinkers and makers and uplift them as well. So when I approached each of the people, like it was really through everything I do is like relational. So it's like, oh, do you know this person? I want to get in touch with this person, and then eventually I find the person. Actually, with Ola from Free Black Women Library, like she wasn't answering email, even though she knew one of the co-directors, Lindsay, who emailed her. So Lindsay was like, let's just roll up to Free Black Women Library. It's like, I think she'll be there. And so we just old school took, walked up, and she was dealing with customers, and we just waited, and we're like, hey, we have this thing. And I felt like a missionary or something going to like recruit someone. And she was like, okay, tell me more. And so we just kind of did it old school. And I really enjoyed that because I too am not a fan of email. So it's a very grassroots endeavor.
Sounds like it. Yeah. I know that you also had a few questions for me.
Yeah.
To ask.
I love this because I think we were also rethinking this meeting and the format of the traditional
artist,
curator tells the artist. And I was like, one reason I wanted to work with you is we did a studio visit, and again, I didn't have to preface you because of your background, but also you had this interest in scrolls, and you had just been going to Ethiopia, and you had shown me the pictures of like different manuscripts and scrolls. So I was just interested to you as an Ethiopian American like curator and cultural worker, like how have you made sense of this like lived experience of this cultural hybridity, being born in the U.S. as well, and then how do you identify? How does your identity play into your curatorial sensibilities? Like whether it's like working with an Ethiopian American artist. Right now, you just opened the project with Kadist, the Brazilian artist at MoMA, through Studio Museum of Harlem, and so yeah, I'm just curious about like how you make that in between this legible for a larger audience.
I really appreciate this question because it's not something that I think I get to think through often, so I really appreciate this invitation. In terms of Ethiopian American identity, it wasn't until last year that I was actually able to visit Ethiopia in person for the very first time. So the identity marker that I felt was closest to me was really Ethiopian American. I grew up in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas, which has a large immigrant population from various cultures, including Ethiopia. So I never felt that I was missing something in terms of a connection to people in my community. but there was a way in which I didn't necessarily have a strong connection to art and culture, partly because I wasn't in my country of heritage, but also because I grew up in a Pentecostal home. And for those of you who might not be familiar, I would say that Orthodox and Pentecostalism is what like Catholicism and Protestant is in the US. So there was a lot of ways that my familiarity with Ethiopian culture was filtered through my parents' interpretation of what was acceptable for us. So I kind of had to wait until I had internet access to learn about Ethiopian culture that I hadn't known before, and I think that that really informed a strong sense of curiosity that I took as my own, that I was able to have a lot of autonomy over because it was something that came from my own curiosities. And I think I want now for any research or work that I do when it comes to artists of African descent, of Ethiopian descent, to be more accessible for people, whether that's through work that I do online. You know, I work at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Our mission is to support artists of African descent locally, nationally, and internationally. As I see you, Kevin, we're colleagues. And so I feel very fortunate that that is already embedded in so much of the work that I do through my research, through administrative work, supporting artists directly. And I would say that there's just an increased focus on accessibility in the work that we do and awareness for artists of African descent that I try to incorporate into my own work, not only because it's part of the mission of the professional organization that I work for, but also because personally I understand the impact of what it means to be able to access information that you might not otherwise be able to have.
I love that. That was a very detailed answer that helped me to understand your perspective a lot more. So I also think that, you know, we're shared because we both were born here, and so we're removed from Ethiopian history and art history specifically. And I'm curious, like, as a curator, you're potentially researching a lot of artists, Ethiopian artists. How have you found other Ethiopian artists who maybe were born here or who are living in Ethiopia, which is a different relationship, incorporating that history? Because it's not as, for me, it's not as well known as other forms of African art history. And so, yeah, what has that been for you? What are the trends that you've seen?
That's an interesting question. And it's hard to think about trends because I think each artist is so singular in their practice and the way that they're using Ethiopian art as an influence in their work. I'll say that, you know, when I learned about your work, it was so exciting for me because I already had a strong interest in collage and archives. And so that was a way that, you know, you were incorporating those materials into your practice. It's also, I think, something that's constantly on my mind is my visit to Ethiopia last year. I was able to visit a lot of art and cultural institutions and see the ways that contemporary artists in Ethiopia were using the country's history as a source of inspiration in their own practice. And so a lot of the research that I was doing when I was there was about artists, but also about institutions as well, just being an institutional worker. And I think that something that I noticed when I was there, and maybe this is also your observation, is that a lot of institutions that housed artworks were also places that spoke to other elements of Ethiopia's history, Ethiopia's imperial history, Ethiopia's material culture, the geography. So it was embedded as part of the understanding of the culture and country, and not necessarily something that was so segmented. Whereas I think here there's more support for an arts infrastructure that allows for solely visual arts institutions. And so I think what that means in terms of visual artists in the US who have ties to Ethiopia is that those elements of material culture or inspirations from it have to be brought into the artwork because it's not something that may naturally exist in the same institution that the work is being shown in. I think as well just having the lack of proximity to an audience that might understand the references changes how you make your work because you may not have access necessarily to an audience that it is immediately legible for.
That's a great response. And I'm learning, and since in my travels I've worked with Ethiopian artists, or I've met and seen their work and been to their studios in Ethiopia, and I've also noticed that, I mean, everything is right readily there, you know, and it's also, like you said, they're being displayed in the same institution. So it's almost like you take it for granted when it's all around you.
Right.
And my last question to you is, my practice is largely about women working together and collaborating to tell larger stories, and I really enjoy this format. I think we both discussed about what it means to rethink institutional spaces and the art ecosystem. And one way to do that is, you know, bringing you back into the conversation, bringing the audience back into the conversation. How do you envision new structures that can support collaborative practices across the art ecosystem, especially among women? All the pressures of the world are on you. You must answer this very tough question. Solve the world's problem right now.
I'm constantly thinking about an event that I attended at the Leslie Lohman Museum a couple years ago called The Poetics of Criticism. And they invited different women art critics to talk about their work, to talk about art in a very closed format. Basically, the setup that they have was kind of similar to the Recess exhibition in that there was a table in which participants could involve themselves in the conversation among the art critics. There wasn't this necessarily super stark hierarchy or contrast between who was an audience member and who was a participant. And so I think a lot about physical structures and including artists, including people who are open to different alternative ways of thinking into the conversation to change the structure of what is possible. Because I think as it currently stands, a lot of the conventional models for holding discussion or discourses about art, for presenting art, are really kind of constricted. And so there's a lot of, I think, reliance and maybe collaboration with artists to help think of new and different structures. As far as what that means for women, I'm constantly thinking about that. I attended a women's college, and when I received my acceptance for admission, the first thing that my mother said to me was, now that you're going to this women's institution, I want you to remember the women in Ethiopia and to think about them in your work. And so I think for me, this is a lifelong kind of mission and intention that I have, that I will be able to answer in more detail, hopefully, as time comes.
I love that. That's actually a really sophisticated answer, so thank you.
I have one last question for you, and then maybe we can transition into questions from the audience. And that is that in your work, there's a strong emphasis on intergenerational relationships. What do you hope that older generations and younger generations of Ethiopians take away from your work?
That's a good question. Yeah, I do think a lot about lineage because I'm working from my own familial lineage in activism, but also because I'm an auntie and I have young people that look up to me, and so I'm like in between, like these generations. And I teach, so I'm constantly, I get to always be in conversation with young people for as long as I teach, which I think is great because I'm much more hip because of it. But yeah, I do think about this kind of like responsibility towards both. But I don't know. I think we have a lot of. We really need to rethink aging in this country too, because aging in Ethiopia looks glamorous to me. Like it just really does. I mean, you are like wisdom keeper. You're revered. You're respected. Like people can't wait for that. It's like I remember just saying like, do I get that privilege as I was a kid? I was like, ooh, do I get this a little bit? And then I realized, oh no, I'm in the wrong country. But I do think we need to think about that, like to sit at the feet of elders, especially those who have been through a lot or whatever they've been through. I just feel like that's the oral history and the archiving for me. It's that, right? And not having, of course, my mother on a personal level, I don't take those things for granted, And then for the younger, I think, generation, I think it's listening in the other direction because they have a different kind of wisdom. They're not as tainted in some things, and they have a freshness. I mean, with my students, it's always a curiosity about Like I love seeing their first art projects because I remember I was like, I think I made something like that, you know. And then I and like to see what it means to mature a project. And it's also like how cliches are like, or the first response to an idea is usually a particular thing, and so I learn a lot, and I put it back into my work. I mean, that's what I get from teaching is I get the experience of seeing so much art. So yeah, I think it's just a lot of listening.
Listening is a great answer. Thank you. I'd like to open up this time to take questions from the audience. Is there any kind of question or comment any of you would like to share?
Hi. I really impressed by your work. And I think it's very important, especially here, especially now, especially in this country. Yes, and what you said about aging and about like became wiser, but it's not working in this country. And here is everything done to divide generations, that they could exist independently, that parents could be independent from kids, kids from their kids, and so on. So here, for many reasons we cannot talk about it, it's too long to talk about it, that's its separation is the main kind of feature of the society. Separation between parties, between generations, between people in different senses. So, and because of this, particularly, that's very important what we're doing. And for some time I worked at UNICEF, and I worked with people from Africa, real people from Africa, not like people who were born here. You see, and I know there are a lot of destruction of all the traditions, but still, in these older traditions, there are a lot of dark side. For example, like if the husband is dead, all possessions of this family taken by brothers and divided by brothers. This woman actually, with kids, left with nothing. So there are a lot of things that kind of could not be considered as positive. So it's extremely difficult for you again to make at least some kind of, I don't know, meaning of it. And again, in all these magic and rituals, there are meaning that we don't already get. You see, and we don't want to get it. You see, so it's, I really admire you that you're getting on all this. That's I could say much more about it because I thought about it. You talked about ancient rituals and how we're failing in our modern rituals, how we're failing everything, and all this separation and distractions. But I kind of maybe you can. I'm not sure. It's not a question, but maybe like you can comment on what do you think about complexity of the problem, not how what you're doing, but how complex it is.
People are complex. People are complex. This art does not solve any of that. Never gonna pretend like that is the case. And culture is complex. I'm sure magic is complex. I'm sure all of these things that we're alluding to has multiple layers. I don't think any of us should be a quick read. I think that we should just kind of like, I think what's beautiful about art is you can listen to other perspectives and voices maybe other than your own. And then we can also be mindful of our own projections and be mindful of our own sort of like assumptions, but yeah, I think what I'm understanding, like I think you're just talking about complexities of human nature, and I don't think my work romanticizes Ethiopian culture. I try not to do that. I also don't romanticize the scrolls. I'm saying they are complicated. You know, I don't know much about them. I've seen a few in person at museums. Like I'm not a carrier of an original one, although you can get them from eBay. So you too can be a carrier if you really want. If you bid well. Yeah, I mean. And I also, I'm fully an American person with an American passport, with American privilege, with American context and sensibilities. So I can't speak to like other, like people who live in that part of the world from a more like lived experience, because I don't think that would be fair. But I can say like, this is my offering. This is like my one gesture. And hopefully, as you're documenting, finding other Ethiopian artists and providing platforms as they're getting, then there's more, and then the complication comes from all of these different perspectives out there in the world.
Thanks for sharing everything here. We talked a lot about research and digging into archives to create the work, but it's also really clear that your work in itself is very much archiving art and activism and the combination of it. And I was just curious if that comes into your conceptualization in a kind of meta way of like pulling from archives and creating an archive, and documenting.
So is the question about, I'm sorry, can you clarify what the exact question? Yeah.
I'm curious if that comes into your conceptualization of creating
recreating.
workshops of the
Yeah.
collage and all
Yeah.
that stuff and pulling from archives to effectively either intentionally or unintentionally archiving and documenting.
Oh, 100%. That's, I think that's also the gesture, right? That's essentially the gesture. And I do love it when they're shown in institutions as like, I came out of like working at an institution as a curatorial intern and saying I'm not a curator, but I want to be back here, I want to come back, but I want to come back with something to say. And so my work has always been in critique of the white cube, like those institutional ivory tower, whatever you call it, as an artist, as a professor, and like rethinking those spaces, and then saying also rethinking what gets stored in those spaces. And so this is an offering of one way to sort of be in conversation with that. What's historicized, what's considered legitimized, bringing more faces, and sometimes there's abstraction in it too, like when I work with more abstracter forms, like basically another way to rethink history, essentially. It is a subjective story. And it's a subjective story where people in power get to say what was. And if you notice, as whenever there's a war, the first thing people do is destroy the monuments, destroy the academic institutions, destroy the library, like destroy the trace of that history and that culture and replace with their own. This is true when the Italians were, conquering the Ethiopians, right? Like they knocked down the obelisks that we had and said, So these are just like, this is a gesture to say if these institutions are going to continue to uphold a history, that there are other forms of histories that conceptualize other bodies. And this is one effort towards that.
Your answer kind of looped around to the question I had and wasn't sure if I was going to ask, and I feel like I should. So I love how you talk about, you said, or the phrase you used I think was like non-traditional scholarship, like the creative practice non-traditional scholarship, which I think is a perfect way to frame sort of doing work that involves research and archive and a creative practice. And something I think about as well, in this conversation about the archive and the destruction of archive or the lack of information archive, like I know you're filling in this place of like women's work as you're moving forward and centering women in the work and the women who are participating, but there's such a lack of actual archived things that deserve space, and I think about that a lot as it relates to African American history in this country, but as it relates to Ethiopian history or all the histories you're looking at. Like how are you thinking about, or how does it come into the work to fill in the spaces using the sort of creative practice as a sort of non-traditional scholarship? Like in what ways do you conceive of those like empty holes
Yeah.
in the archive?
So again, I work with the participants. So they're naming for me. They're doing a lot of the guesswork for me because it's foregrounding what allowed them to take up space here today within these spaces, right? What were the movements that allowed them? So when they fill out the questionnaires, we'll do the Zoom interviews, and sometimes I circle back and I'm like, does this figure work? 'Cause if it's a history, because I work with BIPOC femmes, I don't know everything about every single culture around the world at all times. I just don't. And I want to be educated, I want to learn. So I worked with, for example, Shandine Brown, who was a figure in one of my works at the RISD Museum, and Shandine is Navajo. And so I did the research based on the histories that she had described. And then I circled back and was like, Shandine, what do you think about these? And she was like, oh, no, not this guy. Take him out. And I was like, he did this and that. I was like, oh, okay, I'm not surprised. But so the editing happens, right? So I think like that, for me, it's the methodology of like constantly being a call and response, back and forth. I don't want to take on the responsibility that because then it's also responsibility around power, right? Like that I take this on, that I am able to be authoritative enough to tell you who influenced you. And I don't even know you, right? Like I don't even know what makes you up. And I don't know how you identify. I work with trans bodies as well, and I remember I was working with this trans woman who was like, please look at these archives, and then when I circled back, and she was like, well, actually, I don't think this gay white man's march really responds to how I identify in queer movements. They did nothing for my people, et cetera. This is her words, not mine. And so I circled back and I was like, well, what do you feel about the queer, this rainbow flag? She's like, yes, that works. So it's like really like I'm learning from them, and I'm also saying like, this is subjective. The other thing is there's not a lot of women that are in those archives doing the marches, right? And often if they are there, they're unnamed. So then people often say, well, why are so many men in the collages? And I'm like, well, why? Tell me, what do you think? So I think there's a lot of, there's some like speculation. I mean, I love Sadia Hartman's work. I love this like creative, like making a fiction out of the image. Yeah.
How do you select the medium in which you're going to use or work with, especially in expressing the meaning and the goals of the project? Since you work across such a wide range of mediums.
Yeah, I mean, for a long time I was only a painter, not as painting is lesser, or only, we may have some painters here, so I don't want to defend any painters, but I felt very restricted. So now, once I literally had an identity, like a identity moment where I was like, in grad school, I was like, I'm a painter, what's happening? I was just like, I don't know how to describe it. Like it's like when you learn something about yourself that you're like, I can do this and this is art. And so once I had that breakthrough, I guess like a breakthrough moment, I just kept going. I was like, well, then if I'm not just a painter and I'm, anything can be art, then let's just keep going. So then I was very concept driven and idea driven. And so there's a big writing part of my practice, which I will never like share the writing, but it's just something for me, like a lot of journaling. And so whenever I have these ideas, I'll just circle things and I'll say, what describes that the best? So for the descendants, the gathering of descendants, the civil rights leaders, like this one that just pops up here, that to me felt like a video. It felt like a video performance with very loose direction. And at that point I had no funding, no assistance, nothing. It was like me behind the scenes, me directing it, me editing it, the sound, like the placement, the getting the material. So I really felt like I was like, I had to take responsibility for this because this is kind of like what's out there, but they brought the story, they brought the narrative, and so I could have done it as a painting, but it wouldn't have been as emotive in that way, right? Or I could have done it as a live performance. What are the chances that could actually be, as intimate as it was? So helping people forget the camera is also really important to me. Like getting people comfortable enough, building that rapport where the camera goes away and it's just something that happens real. And we filmed all day. all day. Food was provided like all day, and so real came after not the first hour, but maybe, you know, down the line.
Thank you.
I want to turn the tables on you, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Because it's been incredible listening to you. I mean, Helina has been very generous with the answers, but you've been extremely thoughtful and considerate and generous with the kinds of questions that you are asking. And
Can you speak up?
sorry. I know you've said you've done studio visits with Helina, you've written about her work, and so I'm wondering, what is it that feeds you about Helina's work, like that then kind of leads into other ways of thinking? So I'm not asking you to describe Helina's work because you've seen this, but just on a personal basis, because as a curator, there's often something, like you said, something, it triggers an inspiration that keeps you going in different ways. So could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can say, I think at the top level, there's a way that her work is very visually captivating. I think the first time I encountered her work was online through one of the headdresses, and immediately being able to see that and having your eye go in multiple different directions because there's so much active imagery that's kind of bursting out of these portraits was really incredible to see. And then learning about the history and the process of the ways these are made and the ways that her practice intersects with social practice, I think was really interesting to me. Because I'm someone who thinks a lot about the way that people engage with and think about art, and how that often does not take only the place of like viewing art or being in a museum setting. So knowing that these are artworks that come out of really engaged interactions with people, and that what you're seeing is kind of just one small fraction of everything that has gone into making this work, and that it has impacted people profoundly in personal, intimate ways, I think really makes me feel so, I think, connected and intrigued by Helina's practice. And this is the kind of art that I want to support, and the kind of art that I really want to see more of in the world. And so that is where I think so much of my strong interest comes from. And it's amazing that a lot of it too is the result of having such a strong influence by the Ethiopian heritage and the ways that's implemented into the work. But I think, the core point of it for me is her practice with social practice.
Thank you.
I have another question for Helina. I came to your work through your collages, so I'm curious, when do you know a collage is complete?
Yeah. I just want to quickly address what you just said, because it's, as an artist, and for those who are artists in the room, it's so nice to hear, like, not just because you talk about me, but because, like, what the other side of the table looks like when people are, and I mean, for all of you here that are coming to, like, on a Thursday evening in New York City when you could be doing anything here, I'm like, that's interesting, like, the voluntariness of it all, and, like, the choice. So I just think that's really interesting. And I think sometimes as an artist, when we're just in the studio, we think about audience sometimes, but we don't think about the people that support the work, whether it's Center for Book Arts, Recess, Studio Museum, and you, Kiki, specifically. Like, I sometimes don't think about that, and so it was a great question. And so to your point about what, I feel like it's like when you eat in a meal, and you're like, I can't do no more. And sometimes you have to be careful not to overeat. That's my problem. It's like, I'll like, in real life too, but also like in collage work, I'm just like, I want to do the most. And then I look at it, I'm like, oh my God, it's too much, And so I have to like edit and take it back. So same thing with the book, like editing text for me. Because I knew I wanted to make this book. And at first I was thinking maybe working with a guest writer, but then I was also thinking like, there's so much text here, and I want to get to the point where it feels like poetry. And so you're looking for the poetry in the image, you're looking for the poetry in the text. And as an editor, and collaging as a form of editing, or as an organizer, and like, creating spaces for people to interact, I'm thinking a little bit about what that extra in image, it might be color would be, or in text it might be the adjective, right? Or in a meeting, or for a gathering, it might be sound, smells, food, those kinds of things that just make it feel like you're full, like you've had a good meal.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. This has been such a lovely presentation, conversation. Just like looking, I think you might have touched on the performance methodology earlier, but just looking at your documentation for your work at the Sharjah Biennial, the Willing, even your workshops, I was kind of just like curious about your relationship with performance, or maybe more specifically, like what is the significance of ritual to you, like both in its dogmatic aspects, but also its like affirming and communal aspects as it relates to kind of like reifying like culture and history, but also maybe personally, so any angle.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, ritual is like, I think of the mundane and the rituals of brushing our teeth in the morning and, you know, just the things that we have to do to function and to like pay our bills, you know, as ritual, to everything from the secular to the spiritual, right? To the things that we do to keep our psyche and our spirit intact in order to face another day in a challenging environment or whatever the personal challenge might be. So like all of those things. And you know, one thing I was talking to an artist friend about religion, and she just said she looked at it as a way of how people organize their time, like how they organize their life, like how they organize making meaning, you know. And I mean, I'm not to offend anyone who has a deep religious belief, but it's an orientation, right? And the same thing, and spirituality is another branch of that. It's an orientation with maybe something that's more self-guided, potentially, that's not organized. And so ritual in the sense of performance for me feels like an orientation of our bodies, literally, quite literally, like physically moving our bodies, and as a way to release and also to, you know, take on or to attract. And I love performance art for, I mean, there's all kinds of performance art. I've seen the gamut, and it could go from holy shit to like, you know, very like soft and subtle, you know. And I think the element of risk is what I love, that you don't know what the formula is. You don't know. And so the idea that we're gonna take a journey together. And social practice is that way too, you know, it's a vulnerability of the body. So yeah, and
No, thank you. Sorry, a little follow-up.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
like on a formal level too, like what are the performance traditions that inform like the literal like choreography like, of your work?
Yeah. I mean, I am inspired by ritual and in the ways of Ethiopian art, because in Ethiopian art, almost all the visual art that I grew up knowing was not to just be looked at. And it was not just to be had in an institution for art viewing purposes. They were functional. And they were to be held, to be touched. And I was like, that was so frustrating for me working at, and I love the Walters, but I think all museums, you know, it was just like, we're supposed to engage in it. Like, I think there's ways that, even if you're not supposed to touch it, you know, you're supposed to activate it. That's the word I'm looking for.
Okay.
So when I saw it unactivated on display, it triggered something in me, because I wanted work that you had to activate. So the book, you have to activate this book. You have to say the book, either recite it as an affirmation or gaze upon it, or you have to kind of perform with it. And so I think the methodologies that I'm looking at is definitely African art for that, where I think most art intersects with some sort of ritual or theater on some level, and some sort of spirituality. And then of course, I was trained with like people who were trained by Fluxus, and you know, like kind of like the Boston school, and if anyone's been to Gray Space, shout out Gray Space, Canopy Performance Lab, like that whole kind of Brooklyn sort of performance art was like my grad school, going back and forth between Boston and Brooklyn, you know, so that was more of like a formal way. But I mean, I studied with Helina Metaferia, who's deeply informed with Santeria practices from Cuba, so I think structurally the way I structure a performance is there's always action, there's always, like I'm structuring now for the Bay Area, there's always an action, there's always material, there's always some sort of score, there's always some sort of movement, but then everything else is to chance. Like if you don't have that, you don't have the spice.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for all your questions. I think we're at time for this conversation. Thank you so much, Helina, for being in conversation with me tonight. Thank you all for attending, and we hope you have a good night.
We could play the audio too.
Turn it on.
Thank you. Hey. Good questions from the audience. Like everyone had a good one.
Small but fierce audience.
I know.
Great job. And so, Bill, when I come back, I'm like, oh, no, well, like,
Why doesn't she have my computer? Well, I want to contribute.
yeah, no, it's also much, there's more things we need to like talk about, normal kind of like, you know, if you don't like feel the points.
That's
So
why
just gonna
I want to
play
play
the
I want to hear the spiel.
Yeah,
So-
But
honestly,
we're not going to perform it.
I know.
It's incredible.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny, like, you get studios next to each other for a year and a
It is
half.
true. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so it's
We eat too. Are you performing tonight?
I mean, I've done performances. I don't know if I call
We
myself
are
a performance artist. I do
an
more like visual.
We bring on your
It's like
breath.
kind of like video.
We live in togetherness.
Realm, but
We
yeah,
know
I'm, like, super
connection and
interested in it,
collaboration
too.
are our strengths.
Yeah.
We
Well,
honor
I'm-
each other.
yeah, I'm always thinking if there's another artist.
We care more. We care less. We practice healthy boundaries.
Nice to meet you too.
We focus on our
We never
shared
around in the studio
humanity.
circle, of course.
We let go of the
I'm
wax
like,
skin.
I thought I'm like 3 blocks from your
We
office.
let go of
Oh,
the
really?
And I was
system.
thinking of magazines. I didn't realize the office was right there.
We abolish capitalism. We secure equitable distribution of resources and
Yeah, well, before you were
benefits.
like further on
We
147
share gain.
near where
We support BIPOC businesses.
is that gallery?
We have rock
Brown
reform.
one? They used to be there. Or the studios were there.
We still have the studios there, but we're gonna shut down our 310 next location soon, and then at this.
Chapter 3. Land.
Oh,
Into the building?
To the building?
No,
Oh,
that's-
wrong. I was like,
Yeah, unfortunately,
I know it's a
across
question
the
you get all the time.
Our
What is
interconnectedness with Earth and each other.
There's another new building on 125th Street.
Love the planet.
And what does
Land,
National Urban League
all
building.
living beings.
It's like right next to the Adam Clayton Powell building.
Be in right relationship with the world. And
We'll
come
be
to
there
nature.
along with the Target and
Plant
Trader
a seed.
Joe's.
Yes, I'm so looking forward to that.
There's a Trader Joe's in Harlem?
There's going to be.
Go
In the
vegan.
building.
It's gonna change my whole world.
I'm so jealous.
Hope it's taking too much of my money. I kept saying it's
Free
too far.
Palestine.
West, like the Upper West Side. Okay.
Compost.
Target too, yeah.
I'm so sad.
I've been saying that's the building
Pick up
where I'm
trash.
gonna make my
Freedom
paycheck
from
and
violence.
visit.
Equal
Not bad. I
opportunities
mean,
for
you can go
foreigners.
pretty far with that. Yeah, with Target.
Decolonize this place.
Decolonize this land.
Well, have a good night, everybody.
Decolonize my land.
I'm gonna come.
All right, good to
But
see
it's good to see you.
Creating a connection across the beautiful diaspora.
Have you ever seen her before?
Plants are medicine.
Critical resistance to the destruction of our planet.
Yeah.
Open the border. Talk to the people in the neighborhood.
End global war.
End the war. Change the occupation of our resources.
Zero waste.
Vote. Vote. Vote.
Yeah, I was so
Well, I
Jared
didn't know
bringing back
when you were
when she thought we were.
looking at scrolls.
I was like,
Chapter 4. Letter.
First I'm going to Chicago for a show. My birthday's
Make the
Saturday.
difference.
So my birthday in a spa.
Interact
That's what I'm
with
doing. After I give a
others.
talk, I'm gonna go. Yeah. And then I'm gonna go to SM.
Ancestral knowledge.
I just talked with Lindsay today.
crossing souls home.
planning. So yeah, it's really good.
Remember.
Yeah, that's all you. So more connections. Thanks.
Make an impact.
I think Joey was assuming
Trust and have faith.
Like,
Take care of the women.
I'm sure you had a good
Brings revolutionary children.
I really like it when people are like, no, you need to get this in.
Honor those who choose not to.
But that's the question you asked Kiki, the first
Celebrate
artist,
the
and this is
fathers.
Artnet, by the way.
Live simply.
One of the artists in residence.
Be good to each other and the planet.
We just graduated.
Celebrate each other.
Congratulations. You know, you mean feet.
Widen that.
Especially after people graduating.
Document the moment. Show people who we
But
truly are.
I actually really like, and
Make
not
a
just
better
because, not for
neighbor.
vanity, but yeah, why do you like
Teach the
it?
real
But
history.
because sometimes you just want to and we forget that